Alrighty, we're going to do things slightly different order today. I'm going to be reading the text for today. So, the scripture for today, and feel free to stand if you're willing and able for the reading of the word. We're going to be reading from Exodus 3, verses 7 to 12. All right, we got the NET up there. Let's read from there. The Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt. I've heard their cry because of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. I've come down to deliver them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up from that land to a land that is both good and spacious, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the region of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. And now, indeed, the cry of the Israelites has come to me, and I have also seen how severely the Egyptians oppress them. So now go, and I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. And Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh, or that I should bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And he replied, Surely I will be with you, and this will be the sign to you that I have sent you. When you bring the people out of Egypt, you and they will serve God on this mountain. This is the word of the Lord. You may be seated. And if you want to be closer to the piano, that is where our special guest today, Mark Glanville, will be preaching from the piano. We have such a treat for you today. It'll be a jazz homily. I'm so looking forward to this. By the way, Mark, if you don't know Mark, he was my professor of preaching back at Regent. Currently serves as the director of Center for Missional Leadership at the St. Andrews Hall. And he also does a podcast, the only podcast on a grand piano, Blue Note Theology podcast. And he also is a prolific author, wrote many, many books, the most recent of which is Preaching in a New Key. And so, I'm so happy to introduce to you all my friend, Mark Glanville. Would you give a warm Pilgrim welcome?
So good to be with you. I might just play a quick tune to start. Thanks. It's so good to be with you. Maybe for the fourth time, I think, or something like that. Thanks for having me again. So, very briefly, what I want to talk about is Old Testament law, the laws of the Old Testament, specifically in the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, and how those Old Testament laws, which are a very significant part of the first part of the Bible, were shaping beautiful communities in ancient times, and hopefully shaping beautiful communities today. Old Testament law, or biblical law. The best known of these laws, it might even sound strange when I say Old Testament law, the best known are the 10 Commandments. I'm sure you've heard of the 10 Commandments. In fact, there's new legislation in Texas and Louisiana that insists that the 10 Commandments be displayed in public school classrooms, which I think is a disaster. But there you are. We'll look at the 10 Commandments today. But then there are other laws. There's a large law collections, actually, in the book of Exodus, from chapter 20 on, and in the book of Leviticus, and in the book of Deuteronomy as well, as you can see on the screen. And they're kind of big law collections. Some of those laws I said that the law is shaping beautiful communities. And sometimes that's really obvious. So some of these laws are obviously beautiful. I think, for example, of Deuteronomy 15:4 that simply says, there shall be no poor among you. There should be no poor among you, which is just at first sight, just a very beautiful law. Some are less obvious. So a law that you may have heard and kind of thought of as very strange is a law that's an instruction that says, do not boil a kid in its mother's milk. Do not boil a baby goat in its mother's milk, which is a law that reoccurs a couple of times in the Pentateuch. And at first glance you think, well, that's from a very ancient agrarian time, and it's very odd, you know what I mean? But then when you think about it for a while, you think, oh, actually, there is a beauty there. It's kind of dignifying the life. It's a sanctity of life. Like, it's even dignifying the life of a goat, you know. Ancient Israelites were allowed to eat goats, but this law, don't boil a kid in its mother's milk, is a way of saying, even when you cook, you know, if you're going to eat goats, do it in a way that dignifies their life, because this is life. So that's kind of beautiful too, when you think about it. And these laws are meant to be they're meant to be evocative. They're not just legislation. And so it evokes the sanctity of life beyond that one, maybe strange kind of law. Do you know what I'm saying? So how Old Testament law shapes beautiful communities is where we're going. And I'll talk about, first half of what I'm going to say, I'll kind of take a big lens and talk about these laws, big picture. And then I'll zero in on 3 different laws. So I hope you enjoy it. And what I want to do in this half hour actually is to show a really interesting ancient modern comparison. I want to show how biblical law and jazz music actually have a similar journey or a similar provenance. Both blues and jazz and biblical law were actually birthed, if you like, have their roots in the horror of slavery. So biblical law, you'll remember, has its roots, if you like, or has its historical roots in enslavement in Egypt, in ancient Egypt. You think of the book of Exodus in the Old Testament. And perhaps in a way that mirrors that, jazz and blues music has its historical roots in the evil enslavement of black people in America up until the late mid-1900s, 19th century. So it's this parallel, actually, of the birth, the provenance, the roots of biblical law and of jazz and blues that I'd like to trace. And I find that very interesting as someone who's both an Old Testament scholar and also a jazz and blues musician. So, first of all, let me just go to biblical law and stay with that for a second. A lot of people forget the narrative or story context of these laws. You think of the Ten Commandments and you might forget, it's easy to forget the narrative, the story within which they come to us. So here we are at Mount Sinai in Old Testament times, and Israel is receiving these Ten Commandments along with other laws. But only 2.5 months earlier, they were slaves in Egypt. And so if you just kind of think of that, 2.5 months, and that's the wilderness wanderings there, between Exodus 16 and Exodus 19. Then there's the Ten Commandments in Exodus 20. And that emancipation, that fleeing Egypt, is Exodus 14. Then 2.5 months later, so when they receive these laws, the Ten Commandments, and these other beautiful laws, this is really a nation of slaves. You know, the wounds, the suffering is incredibly raw, right? And so that's the narrative background. And you'll see, and I'm going to show you, that with these laws given at Sinai, God is shaping God's ancient people to be a beautiful community that's opposite to the oppression of Egypt. There's to be no pharaohs among God's people, those who just want to accumulate resources at other people's expense. It's a community, instead of a community of oppression, a community that brings the weakest among them into the center. So that's the narrative background. So once again, this parallel is in jazz and blues, this historical roots in the horror of enslavement of black people in America. And somehow, but by the genius of the black community and the inspiration of the Spirit, I think, the birth of jazz and blues music. And in that parallel, the biblical law have those similar historical roots in ancient enslavement in Egypt. And this law is given. That's kind of singing the song of the human soul. So let me now come to jazz for a second and show you a bit more about how that works. So I'm sure you're aware of the evil of the enslavement of black people in the United States for centuries. And an enslavement that didn't end until the 1860s. So very troublingly, quite recent. And jazz and blues music was really birthed out of that story of the suffering, but also the genius of the black community. And so I'm just going to show you, how many of you are musicians here who will understand if I talk a little bit about music for a second? A few of you, enough to persevere. So I'll talk. Let me actually talk about theory for a second and illustrate what I'm saying. So I'm going to think in the key of C. And so in classical music, in Western classical music, like a very important interval would be, say, the major third, right? So here's C to E. And it's a harmonious interval, right? So in blues, there's three what we call blue notes. And blue notes have tension. They speak of trouble, but they're also very beautiful. And so the first blue note is, think of C to E, and the first blue note is a flattened third, so C to E flat. And that's characteristic of the blues music and therefore jazz. I'll just show you. So it's really common to trill the third. And then the second blue note is a flattened seventh. So in Western classical music, a major seventh would be, say, C to B. And then a flattened seventh, C to B flat. And that's the second one. Back to the third there. So you can see that harmonically, these three blues notes, in a sense, you can see kind of theoretically, if you like, how it expresses, the blues express the story, how it tells of that tension, that suffering, the evil, but actually with incredible beauty and incredible hope. It's genius. And then the third blue note, which I haven't given you yet, is, anyone want to guess? The flattened flattened fifth. Nice, Joshy. So the flattened fifth. So C to G flat, instead of C to G, which is a perfect fifth, we flatten the fifth and it's G flat. And this is the most, perhaps tense of all. But you can recognize it from those rock and roll kind of players like Little Richard. That's flattened fifth to flattened third. So you can see then that jazz and blues is birthed from this historical context. It has its historical roots in the evil of slavery and the ongoing oppression of racism into the 20th century, when blues took its more mature form that it has now, and also jazz was birthed, still in this same story of racism, but the genius, right, of the music and the life in the music. It's such a gift, not just to the black community, but to every community. So let me just then play a blues now. I'll take a more serious kind of tone, because the blues has the moan of the cross. It has that blues moan. But the blues moan is never far away from a resurrection shout, because it is spiritual music. There's always the moan of the cross, the blues moan, and the resurrection shout. So I'll just play a blues. This is an old tune called Things Aren't What They Used to Be. So, again, just to repeat this comparison that we're doing, that both biblical law and jazz and blues has its roots, historical roots, in slavery. And both jazz and the blues, and also biblical law, somehow invites us to something more beautiful. That in a place of deep atrocity and evil, in both cases, God is birthing something beautiful. Jazz and blues sings a song of the human spirit and invites us to something more hopeful. And so does biblical law, even though it's not a song, it sort of is. So that's what we're going to do now. We're just going to hold that comparison. And so I'd like now to drop down deep into biblical law and to examine with you 3 different laws, some of which will be very familiar, some unfamiliar, to illustrate what I'm saying. And then I'll finish and sit down and leave you alone. So just once again, just to remind you of the historical narrative of the Old Testament, let's just consider what life had been like for ancient Israel in Egypt. You remember the story from the opening chapters of the book of Exodus. You remember how the Hebrews were enslaved. You remember from Exodus chapter 1 how Pharaoh put them to work building store cities of Pithom and Ramesses. Then you come to Exodus 5 and Israelite foremen are being beaten, so literally to death, no doubt, in order to keep brick quotas. So economic productivity was God in Egypt. And then you remember the genocide. Again, Hebrews 1 and 2, Hebrew babies, male babies being destroyed, being killed, to keep this labor force in subjugation. You remember that story. I mean, we know it as a children's story in a way, if you grew up in the church, but of course it's no children's story. And, we know of similar atrocities going on even today. And then perhaps you remember Exodus 3 and 4, the burning bush. So Moses is grazing sheep. He fled to Midian. He's grazing sheep, and at this highly unusual event of a burning bush, very unusual even in terms of ancient literature that we have, Yahweh appears to Moses in a burning bush. And Yahweh says, I've seen the suffering, the misery of my people. I know their suffering. I hear their cry. Tza'ak, the cry of the oppressed, this technical Hebrew word for the cry of the oppressed. And I've come down to redeem. And then there is this great act of slave emancipation. And you remember they crossed the Red Sea, the Sea of Reeds, literally. And 2.5 months later, here we are at Sinai. And we receive these laws that's shaping God's people, as you'll see now, to be a community that's in contradistinction to Egypt, completely different from Egypt, the opposite to Egypt. A community that brings the weakest among them into the center of the community. A place where everyone can flourish. And this law that we're going to look at now, actually it becomes a foundation for biblical ethics. It's absolutely crucial in terms of the canon of the Bible, of the biblical story. It's foundational for the life of Jesus even, as Jesus comes as the true Israelite, as the King of Israel, as the one who's birthing a new Israel. Think of Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5-7. It's just foundational for biblical theology. Okay, that's enough prolegomena, that's enough preface. Let's get into the laws. So here's the first one. Here, I'll pop this one up. Example 1. So example 1 is from Deuteronomy 24, and it's a prohibition. It says, do not take a widow's garment in pledge. Do not take a widow's garment in pledge. And I'll read it to you. Do not take a widow's garment in pledge. Remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. Therefore, I command you to do this. So, pledge is security against a loan. That unusual for us law is saying, if you make a loan to a widow because she needs it, don't take her garment as security against the loan. Just loan her the money. Or maybe if she needs it and can't pay it back, just give her the money. But don't take her outer garment in pledge. An outer garment in ancient times was like a cloak, and it's what kept people dry during the day and warm at night. So it was really to do with staying alive. And it would have been a person's last possession who was impoverished. And of course, taking out a loan in that kind of subsistence economy, and a widow, so she's already vulnerable, it wasn't unusual for someone or a household to take out a loan to plant a crop. You take out a loan so that you can plant a crop and you can farm for this next season. And so it's saying, if someone who's vulnerable, definitely a widow, but it extends beyond widows, the spirit of the law, if someone needs a loan, then be generous to them. Definitely don't lend to them in a way that costs them something more, or that threatens their livelihood even more, or threatens their life itself, so that they become more impoverished. Kind of a cool law. We could just summarize that law with the word compassion, say. That could be our takeaway word from that first law. So that's one of three. That wasn't too bad, was it? Let's go to the next one. So the next one is one that you'll know, the 8th commandment, you shall not steal. So here we are in the 10 Commandments, and that's in Exodus 20. As I said, it's repeated in Deuteronomy 19, just when Israel's about to enter the land. In Deuteronomy, the 10 Commandments are given a second time. The 8th command, thou shalt not steal. This is an interesting one. So when I was a little kid, I mean, if any of all the 10 Commandments are misunderstood, but this one perhaps more than any. When I was a little kid, yes, but also when I was an adult, when I heard thou shalt not steal, I would really think, my mind, the image I had was hamburger at McDonald's. I take it from the laugh. You had that in Canada too. I grew up in Australia. So I was really thinking, I was thinking of a poor person breaking into a rich person's mansion and creeping around at night with the black mask, kind of like, finds a diamond ring. Something like that. But you probably have a sense. So hamburger from McDonald's is probably the image that all of us take, probably. You can nod if you can kind of relate to that when you think of thou shalt not steal, petty theft. But you could probably already have a sense of the spirit of these commands by the other laws I've mentioned, and also by the narrative context of the laws. What the Torah, what the law, Torah is a Jewish word for law, what the Torah is really doing, it's shaping ancient Israel as a contrastive community that looked nothing like Egypt. So actually when it comes to thou shalt not steal, it was doing the opposite thing. It was restraining would-be pharaohs. It was restraining those who had wealth and means and power from gaining more wealth and means and power at the expense of others. It was really saying there should be no pharaohs among you who are accumulating at other people's expense. And if you want to check me on that, you could read the rest of Deuteronomy 24 that had that widow's garment law, and just get a sense, or check Isaiah 58, 59, and just see these other texts that show the spirit of the law. So just to illustrate this, thou shalt not steal, I could go to 10 different lenses, but let me go to land law in ancient Israel for a moment to illustrate this. So you probably, if you know a little bit about the Old Testament, you'll know a little bit about how land worked, maybe. You remember that every family, every household was attached to a plot of land. And that land is what we call inalienable, which means it can't be taken permanently from a clan. In order to secure a loan, the land could be given up for a few years, but every 50 years the land returns to the family, like a yo-yo. And so this kind of idea of inalienable land meant that every clan and every household had means, had a way of thriving, of flourishing on the land. It was a system whereby every clan could flourish. Every household could not only survive but flourish. And no one household could accumulate at the expense of everyone else. Because in the end, land is the most important resource. And land belongs to everyone. The guideline that undergirds this ethic in the Old Testament is this: God owns it all, and God wants everyone to be able to share some of it. God owns it all, and God wants everyone to be able to share some of it, which is completely different to the way that Egypt, that God has released them from, operated, right? So the word that I want to take away from this one is sharing. actually. We had compassion from the widow's garment, and let's take the word sharing. Making sure that everyone has enough to flourish. From this second law, thou shalt not steal. It's interesting to think through how that can look in our own lives in Vancouver. Most families, who are, my age or younger, we're flat out just getting through, right? Can we keep our house? Can we pay our mortgage on our apartment? Could we ever have a mortgage on an apartment? Right? It's not the kind of lifestyle where we've got these tens of thousands of dollars that we're just kind of spending on, flights to... Right? It is a hard city to live in. So what does it look like for us? Well, I think it requires honesty and imagination. And I think we have to be creative in how we live into it. For Erin and I, who we eat with is very significant in shaping us, in shaping our hearts. I noticed this funny thing in our lives to do with our dining table, actually. So if you eat at our house one day, you'll see that our dining table, it's a bit scratched up, and our cutlery and our cups don't match too well. We don't know how to set a really nice table. It's funny, like I love it when people set a nice table. Some people are really good at making a table look beautiful. I'm not. And so we drink out of jam jars, and our table is scratched up, and I like visual aesthetics, and I love it when someone sets a nice table, and I wish I could, but we don't. So sometimes I notice when Erin and I kind of host well-to-do middle-class friends, say academics like ourselves, I feel a bit embarrassed by our table, that it doesn't look nicer. I'm kind of, pouring them a drink in a raspberry jam jar, and I feel a little bit self-conscious that it looks crap. But then, this curious thing is, I notice that when we eat with our friends who live a marginalised life, maybe refugee newcomers to Canada, or people who've known addictions, I notice that they come into our living room and they feel uncomfortable at our wealth and at our comfort, and they feel uncomfortable. Like that, I can tell they don't feel like they belong in our house. And then I feel embarrassed for another reason. So that's just interesting. And then all of a sudden my world turns upside down and I realize, I've got tons, How can I live in a way where I'm transformed in relationships with other people who have really different lives to me? So I think thou shalt not steal, just being aware of my heart and who I'm eating with, who I'm being close to and who I'm spending my time with, is one way for me to live into that. I wonder if there's an invitation there for you. So thou shalt not steal, sharing. Though there's more than just sharing. First one's compassion, second one's sharing. Let me quickly go to a third law now. Example 3 is to do with the stranger. Love the stranger in Deuteronomy 10, 17 and 29. So Deuteronomy 10, it's the fifth book in the Pentateuch. It says, love the stranger. The Lord executes justice for the fatherless and the widow, and loves the stranger, giving them food and clothing. Love the stranger, therefore, for you are strangers in the land of Egypt. It says the Lord loves the stranger, and the stranger in Deuteronomy 10, we're getting into a different category now. It's a vulnerable immigrant. It's a refugee in ancient times. And God is saying to ancient Israel to love this vulnerable immigrant, to love the refugee who is living among you. That's really interesting. Here is a nation of ex-slaves about to embark on being a society together. And God, as God sets up this society at Sinai, says, there's going to be refugees, there's going to be vulnerable immigrants among you. You guys are vulnerable immigrants right now. And you're to embrace that person and to enfold them. The word love, just so you know, is a very, very powerful word. It's more powerful than the English word love. The English word love really, in terms of meaning of that word as we use it, emotion would be the primary kind of content. You love someone, you have these feelings. You have this kind of like a feeling of moving toward that person, you know. But love in Deuteronomy is different. It doesn't start with emotion, no emotion's there. It actually refers to the covenant, which is the ancient treaties between the great kings in the ancient world. So in the ancient world, if a great king subjugated, conquered by military force another king, the great king would subjugate that king and kind of contract them under what we call a treaty or an oath or a covenant. And that word love is used in that treaty. The subjugated king who's been conquered must love the great king who's conquered them. Love is just unfailing loyalty, absolute, steadfast loyalty. It's just actually kind of a militarized metaphor. It's pretty ugly, but these scribes, by the inspiration of the Spirit, had the wisdom and the vision to kind of use this ancient, ugly metaphor and to change it, to transform it, to communicate something about a God of grace. And it says in verse 12, which isn't on the screen, Yahweh loved you and chose your fathers. So this steadfast covenant loyalty that Yahweh had with Israel's fathers. And then it says, and Yahweh has this love, this covenant loyalty to the refugee. And so you would have this covenant loyalty to the vulnerable immigrant. This steadfast loyalty, this is the ethic, this is the way of life. These are the commitments that Yahweh, God, was shaping this new community to have, to be. And so, you know, what that could look like in real life is, you know, in this ancient world, this ancient farming community, if there is someone, a family that had been displaced because of famine, because of war, and they're wandering those dusty hills, bring them in and enfold them as you would family, not just as cheap labor, but as people who belong to you, as people who you're committed to their flourishing. Love a stranger. So the word that I'll take from this one is solidarity, a familial solidarity. So we got compassion, which was the garment, then stealing, thou shalt not steal, we took sharing, then love the stranger, love, covenant, solidarity. They're the three words we'll take. Hey, I should just play for a second and then we'll tie it all together. So I'll just play with that word love. Here's a song about love that you've heard before. Let me just pull it all together for us now and jolly well sit down and get out of your hair. So we've looked at three laws. And the big picture is we were tracing this parallel between the historical roots of jazz and blues and the historical roots of biblical law. And in both cases, fascinatingly and dreadfully, but significantly, its historical roots in the horror and the evil of the enslavement of one people by another. And out of this evil, God, by the Spirit, is birthing something beautiful. The genius of the black American people, the genius of the ancient Israelite scribes, and I think the inspiration of the Spirit in both cases. I take a lot of comfort in that in places of dark evil, God is, by the Spirit, often birthing something beautiful. It doesn't justify the evil for a moment, but it's hopeful, especially when you think about a cultural moment like we're in now. That God can do amazing things, can emancipate slaves, can turn the world upside down, can shape communities that bring the weakest among them into the center, can shape communities that display in their shared life together the tenderness of Jesus. The Spirit can do that in context of atrocity. And I think that both this music and biblical law, which is the foundation of the ethical side of biblical theology, we see up close and personal in the life of Jesus. That these are examples of that. So these three words were taken away: compassion, sharing, solidarity. Compassion was the widow's garment. Sharing was thou shalt not steal. And solidarity is that law, love the stranger. So the law was shaping a renewed community where every person can flourish, especially the most vulnerable. A community that's completely the opposite to the oppression of Egypt. So what does that mean for us today? Well, let me leave you with a couple of thoughts. I mean, I wonder what this could mean for your house, you know. I wonder, your takeaway question for you and your household could just be, who do we eat with? Who are we being kind of knit together as family with around our dinner table? And you want to just kind of reconfigure that a little and just seek to eat with people who have a slightly different life experience to you for that mutual transformation and deepening and softening of your heart. I think related to that, for Aaron and I, that related question is, what are we modeling to our children? Which goes hand in hand with that, who do we eat with? You know, what are we modeling for our children? Are we living that upside down way of Jesus in a way that's transforming for us, but also modeling something beautiful for our children? That's perhaps a second takeaway, just to hold that question. How are we kind of living out the kingdom of God so our young people and our kids can be brought up in this way, which is in the end the way of the Bible, as you can see. Then a third question, which is just, I don't know the answer to this question. I don't know the answer to any of the questions, but what's the invitation for you as a church in your life in the neighborhood here, you know? What's the invitation for you as a church? It's not a question you'd want to answer quickly. I'm sure you already perhaps are living into this way of Jesus that we see in this text already, in some ways as a community. And what invitation is there to go deeper? And vision grows slowly. A good vision is deep and it grows slowly. Comes from the whole community. But just to hold that question with curiosity. Yeah. Well, gosh, it's been a long time, Josh. Flip. What are you going to move in here? Bring a bed and... Hey, it's been great to be with you. Thank you for having me.
Seriously, what a treat. Wow. Well, we're going to move into a...
tendencies. I don't know how else to phrase that, but yeah. But that being said, we have brought flowers, so there are roses for the, for in celebration. So you're welcome to take one. And also there is ice cream mochi available. Wait, no, I got that wrong. Mother's Day mochi. There we go. We got the... Josh said to do the alliteration, so I had to make a note of that. So there we go. So we have the Mother's Day mochi that is available for everyone. We invite you to share and celebrate with us. So, let's go out and celebrate.